When did international relations begin? The beginning of this discipline is often traced back to 1648, when the Treaty of Westphalia was signed. But this is not fully accurate. Setting the Treaty of Westphalia as the starting point of IR is a very Western way of viewing the discipline, and it would rather have to be considered from a global and historical perspective. But then, when did it really begin? In order to answer the question, we have divided the research into 3 different points. The first one is, what is IR and why it is analyzed from an erroneous perspective, including the notion of ethnocentrism in which international relations is usually analyzed. The second is how interaction makes IR. We will be exemplifying and highlighting the importance of interaction in the discipline of international relations. And last but not least, we will evidence interaction in what are considered to be the first fully fledged city-states, the Sumerian. But let's start from the beginning.
The discipline of international relations can be defined as the discipline that studies interactions between and among states, and more broadly, the workings of the international system as a whole. It can be conceived of either as a multidisciplinary field, gathering together the international aspects of politics, economics, history, law, and sociology, or as a meta-discipline focusing on the systemic structures and patterns of interaction of the human species taken as a whole. The origins of international relations have been controversially discussed for years. Mainstream studies believe that its origins are traced back to the Treaty of Westphalia, signed in 1648, in which they correlate the development and formation of the international system with the treaty. Authors such as Evans and Newnham find that a number of important principles, which were subsequently to form the legal and political framework of modern interstate relations, were established at Westphalia. It explicitly recognized a society of states based on the principle of territorial sovereignty in the Dictionary of World Politics. Moreover, Hans Mortingau defended that rules of international law were securely established in 1648. Nevertheless, for decades, several scholars have rejected this mainstream theory. For instance, according to Buzan and Little, the origins of the discipline go back to the transfer among the hunter-gatherers to established agriculture about 15,000 years ago. They underline the fact that the previous were groups that, although were connected within each other, formed nomadic small-gatherer bands, without an internal hierarchy which would engage political dynamics. Furthermore, they did not have a distinct division among outside and inside. In conclusion, Buzan and Little argued that the development of agriculture cultivated state formation and promoted foreign geopolitics. With the Westphalian narrative, scholars have constructed rather an ethnocentric-based theory, in which Western societies are the ones who create the patterns and institutions of the international community, and non-Western societies lack these until they acquire them. From this perspective, international society is based on a hierarchy which is expected to reflect the natural division of labor in the field of international relations. Moreover, this intellectual construct became an ideological tool to excuse the coercion used by Western states over non-Western states as a necessary evil, required in order to get them to conform to the rules of international society. To sum up, the idea that ER began with the Treaty of Westphalia is, in our opinion, overly inaccurate. The fact of bringing international relations origins back to 1648 not only comes from a very Western idea, but it also comes from a notion of ethnocentrism. The idea of evaluating ER from the perspective of the modern world is ethnocentric and rather ignorant. It fails at analyzing times past and it invalidates the possibility of looking more in depth into the process and therefore obtaining truthful information.
Following this discussion, an answer to the question, do you think international relations began in 1648, will now be provided. In order to get a deeper understanding of the ideas mentioned in the thesis, the importance of interaction in the discipline of international relations will now be highlighted. Around 5,500 years ago, the first international system emerged, and so did international relations. Sumerian city-states have been therefore the pioneers of a fully developed international system, and we are now going to look at the main types of interaction that developed. The first type of interaction at which we will look at is trade, which represents the economic approach. Trade required transportation that varied depending on the product. It could be achieved through low interaction between political entities if the products were of a little volume and highly demanded. The most common way of transportation was through water, as it allowed to move many products with little effort. As we can see in the first image, Sumerians developed canals in order to facilitate transportation. Moreover, the second picture aims to exemplify how Sumerian city-states developed trade relations with other polities by showing a semi-precious stone called lapis lazuli, which was imported from Afghanistan to Sumeria. This shows that trade was already highly developed, as these materials were transported for more than 2,000 kilometers. Secondly, another important example of interaction was culture and religion, which represented the social approach. Culture and religion increased interaction capacity as a result of having charismatic leaders in front, helping polities, states, or civilizations to spread across the world. Thirdly, it is also important to look at the military approach through war, as it was one of the first forms of interaction that emerged, and the one that required the highest level of interaction. So, in order for it to happen, it is necessary to have the following: reasons to fight, resources, people to fight, logistics and money, or other ways of exchanging. So, as we can see, war itself implied many other forms of interaction. First, war happened on a small scale because the groups involved in it were nomadic. However, after the creation of Sumerian city-states, the polities interacting on the war were sedentary, and therefore, they were able to manage big-scale wars with a high level of interaction. Finally, this picture provides evidence of war in Sumerian city-states by showing the stele of the vultures, which is the first historiographical document commemorating the victory of the Sumerian city-state of Lagash over its neighbor Umma around 2450 before Christ. Finally, the fourth and last example of interaction would be diplomacy, which represents the political approach. Diplomacy can be described as a way of maintaining peace and good relations with near neighbors. It required a medium level of interaction capacity, and this image shows the most important example of diplomacy in Sumerian city-states, the Amarna letters. So, all of these approaches, which have been mentioned, required a certain level of interaction, being low or high, as well as a connection or link between two or more polities. The Sumerian city-states have given a lot of evidence of interaction capacity, which according to Busan, very little, can be described as the amount of transportation, communications, and organizational capability. Moreover, units must be interacting for a system to exist. It is, therefore, the reason why we believe that IR began back then, about 5,500 years ago, when the first international systems emerged.
City-states are key to the emergence of international systems, but we must understand what they are. City-states emerged in the second wave of international relations, around 5,500 years ago. The rise of city-states was the emergence of a new type of unit that was larger and more complex than any existing precedent units, such as hunter-gatherer bands, tribes, and chiefdoms, which were the units that dominated the pre-international system. These city-states were characterized by the following features. First of all, an internal structure with a form of government or political institutions capable of asserting government and claiming authority. They also had a more military political nature and pursued power and security. And lastly, the use of war and diplomacy to relate within each other and with neighboring regions. We can now begin to understand what the Sumerian were and why they were considered the first fully fledged city-states. They emerged in the Mesopotamian region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and their most important city was Uruk. They were pretty much known for their innovations in architecture and governance, among others. They also had very organized religions, centralized governments, social hierarchies, and access to trade networks. And also, they had their own language and were the first civilization to leave permanent written records. But most importantly, Sumerian city-states were the first city-states to interact in economical, cultural, and military reasons, and therefore, they became the first example of international relations in history. Economic interaction raced with the development of trade. What led Sumerian city-states to trade was, on the one hand, the agricultural surplus they possessed, and on the other hand, the devoid of certain materials on their lands, such as minerals or raw materials. There was, therefore, a well-regulated system of exchanges in Sumeria, with grain being their main export, but also of a great variety of textiles, as well as of manufactured goods and slave trade. Moving on to cultural interactions, Sumerians also shared cultural elements, on a much greater scale than previous civilizations. One of the main cultural elements was religion. As a matter of fact, Sumerian city-states had a shared religion and took God as their supreme leader. From an early stage in their history, they established religious centers, which provided a focal point for pilgrimages. Another shared cultural element is a common language. Sumer had its own language, called Sumerian, which was spoken until about the 19,000 before the Common Era, when it became a dead language. It was, after that, replaced with Akkadian, but still used very frequently in documents and for religious purposes. From the Sumerian language also emerged writing. We start seeing forms of writing, as the proto-cuneiform scripts such as the one we can observe in the picture. Writing took time to develop. At the beginning, it could not specify names because it was abstract, so they used to break the name by syllables, and each syllable would be represented by a picture. But Sumerian city-states also engaged in near-constant wars due to this emergence of trade, and the conflict settled the need for a military defense. Warfare becomes so evident that they established walls surrounding the cities. And in order to maintain peace, there was a creation of pacts within states, in other words, diplomacy.
The mainstream scholars defend that the origins of ER are traced back to the Peace of Westphalia, which is rather a Western perspective. Interaction is the basis of the discipline of ER, and therefore its origins are found when interactions between civilizations began. And lastly, Sumerian city-states were the first example of ER as they showed a high level of interaction in terms of military, economic, and cultural elements.